Hey, everybody, and welcome back to BizBooks. This is my twice monthly conversation and interview series that I'm doing with some great authors of great business books. I am so happy to have Kim Scott here with me, talking to me all the way from California. Kim, first of all, can I just say hello? Thanks for joining me.
Hello to you. It's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Sure. And we're going to dive into your book, which is called Just Work, Get Shit Done, Fast and Fair. I love the title. I love the book. There's a lot of great information in it that really is for business leaders and managers and owners of all sizes running companies. So to start off with, Kim, you write in your book, you go, at some level, just work, that's the title of this book, is so very simple. It's about respecting each person's individuality so you can collaborate and get shit done, right? So,
yes, that's it. So simple.
as simple as that sounds, why is this so rare? Tell me why this doesn't happen.
Yeah, what gets in the way? So if you want to, the broad term is workplace injustice gets in the way. But what I tried to do in this book is to break that down into its component parts, because that feels like a very monolithic, impossible to solve problem. And I want to solve this problem. So bias, prejudice, and bullying, I think, are the root causes of workplace injustice, of the things that get in the way of our ability to just work.
Right.
And when you layer power on top of bias, prejudice, and bullying, you get discrimination, harassment, and physical violations. And so those are the things that I hope after you read this book, you'll have some good ideas of how to deal with them, whether you're the leader of the team or whether these things are happening to you, or whether you're observing them happening, or whether you realize that you're the perpetrator of these things, and you get some feedback that you've been biased or worse.
So what makes you an expert on this topic? Tell us a little bit about your background.
So nothing makes me an expert on this topic other than just life experience. So when I started a company to help folks put the ideas in the book into practice, I partnered with Trier Bryant, who had been a chief people officer and who has a lifelong experience in DE&I work. My experience is mostly, if Trier is the dentist, I've had a lot of root canals, so that's what allows me to. And I've experienced all of these things. I've been on the receiving end of bias, prejudice, bullying, discrimination, harassment, and physical violations. But I also, and that was hard for me to come to grips with. My previous book was called Radical Candor, and it's kind of hard for the author of a book called Radical Candor to admit that I was in denial about the things that had happened to me as a woman in the workplace. No, I didn't like to think of myself as a victim.
Right.
And I don't think of myself as a victim, but that doesn't mean I wasn't harmed by these attitudes and behaviors. Even less than wanting to think of myself as a victim did I ever want to think of myself as a perpetrator, right?
Right.
But I try to be honest with myself and with the readers in this book. And it's not like I am bias free. I don't think anyone is bias free. And so there are plenty of instances where I did bully other people. I did cause harm. And I observed plenty of this, but probably hardest for me to come to grips with was my role as leader. I often did not create the kind of workplace environments in which people could just work.
Right.
And I let bias, prejudice, bullying get in the way. I let discrimination and harassment and physical violations happen. And I think it's important to think very clearly about what is our responsibility. Like as a person harmed by these things, my responsibility, I think, is to choose a response.
Right.
And silence is a choice, but what I want to do in the book is end the default to silence. I think too often I defaulted to silence, and then that caused more problems down the road for me. But if you're the observer, it's your responsibility to intervene. And if you are the leader, it's your responsibility to take action that will prevent this stuff from continuing to happen. And if you're the person who has caused harm, which we all are from time to time, it's your job to listen to the feedback that you're getting and to address it.
You talk about the person who caused harm, and you write in your book about sort of common rationalizations that people make. They go, hey, I'm a nice person, or they didn't mean any harm, or it's probably no big deal. Talk to me about these rationalizations and how they kind of get in the way of of identifying bias and prejudice.
Yeah, good people do bad things all the time.
Mm.
And I think that if there's one phrase I would like us all to challenge all the time, it's it's okay, he's a good guy. It's okay, she's a good person.
Yeah.
It's not okay. Like maybe she's a good guy or she's a good person, he's a good guy, whatever, but that doesn't mean that person didn't cause harm, didn't do something wrong. And so I think that rationalization is a big one. Another rationalization that I think we use all the time is, oh, it's no big deal.
Right.
And maybe this instance is not a big deal in and of itself, but very often this stuff, when you experience it over and over and over again, it's like repetitive stress injury. And that hurts. Like that can become debilitating over time. It's like death by 1,000 paper cuts. So I think it's important to remember that. I think another thing, let's go back to don't worry about it. This is a good person.
Right.
If this person is a good person, and if you care about this person, they don't want to be causing harm. They want to know and they want to fix it. And so you're not doing that person any favors not to tell them that they're doing something that is wrong. It's sort of like my son's baseball coach said to the team, you can't do right if you don't know what you're doing wrong. Mm-hmm. And this kid, was running bases and not hitting the bases and wouldn't admit it. And so then the coach really kind of got in his face and said, you're not touching the base. And the kid burst into tears. And the coach is like, I'm not trying to hurt your feelings, but you're not going to win the game unless you learn how to touch the base. So same kind of stuff.
It's funny because you bring up the example. I mean, I actually think personally about my sister as well. My sister, and I tell this to her right to her face. We have a good relationship, but she can be a bully. In the way that she acts, both personally, and in our family, and also I think at work as well. She's a good person. I mean, we're all good people, right? I mean, everybody's trying their best, but sometimes she does, I don't want to say bad things, but things that she needs to be called out on. And I think we're all guilty of that at different times, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I tell a story in the book about, I was recording a podcast with Russ Laraway, who is someone who I had worked with for a long time, someone I like and respect a lot. Mm-hmm. And in the podcast, we were going to talk about Amy Cuddy's power pose, or I was going to talk about it.
Okay.
And Russ there had been Amy Cuddy had recently said that there was new research that demonstrated that when you do the power pose, it doesn't actually increase your testosterone levels. It still works for a variety of other reasons. Anyway, so Russ was trying to tell me this, because I was like, it's incredible. Your testosterone levels go up and your cortisol levels go down. And Russ was trying to tell me that was wrong. And I just looked at him, and Russ is a white man and a Marine and, kind of tough. And I said, oh, Russ, you were born doing the power pose. What do you know about it? And so this was me being a bully. And then everyone in the room, everyone else working on this podcast was a woman. And everybody laughed with laughter. And Russ felt humiliated. And did I guess in the strict definition of bullying, I wasn't a bully, because when he pointed out to me later what I had done, I apologized. But it was in the moment, that was just being mean. And if you think about the difference, like, let's give some quick definitions for these things: bias, prejudice, and bullying. Bullying, I think, is just being mean. Bias is not meaning it. It's some kind of unconscious kind of brain hiccup. But prejudice is actually meaning it. This is a very consciously held prejudice. And so responding to each of these things requires a different response to be effective.
Fair enough. All right, let's keep moving on. You talk about there are different parties that are involved in bullying and in bias and prejudice. That all these, it's not just somebody operating in a vacuum. There has to be other people, and one of those parties are observers, right? People that see this happening. And you talk about the upstander. You even told a story of Eileen Lee, a partner at Kleiner Perkins. Can you elaborate on what an upstander is and tell us a little bit about Eileen?
Yeah, absolutely. I love the story that Aileen now has started Cowboy VC. So she's got her own firm, and Aileen is tough. Aileen can certainly stand up for herself, but she said, "Why should I have to? It's so much better when another person who observes what's going on speaks up." Mm-hmm. Rather than the person who's the target of the bias. So in the story she told me, she said, I was going into a meeting with a big client, and I was going in with two men who were my business partners, and they sat down at the table. And Aileen, who had the expertise that was going to win her team the deal, sat in the center of the table, and the two guys sat to her left. The people from the other company came in, and the first guy sat across from the guy to Aileen's left. The next guy came in and sat across from the guy to his left, and then they went on down the table, leaving Aileen dangling by herself. And you're shaking your head. That's often, though, the small way that bias shows up, is just who we decide to sit next to or across from.
Sure.
So Aileen starts talking, and when the other side has questions, they direct them to the two men, their questions to the two men who are with her. Okay. And it happens once, it happens twice, it happened a third time. And finally, the guy to her left stood up and he said, "I think Aileen and I should switch seats." And they did. And that was all it took to totally change the dynamic in the room. The other side kind of realized they were what they were doing, and they changed their behavior. So no big deal, really. So why did he do that? It's worth thinking about it. Part of it is that he liked Aileen and he didn't like seeing her get ignored. But the other reason why he did it is that he just wanted to win the deal. And he knew if they weren't listening to Aileen, that they wouldn't win the deal. And so there's sort of an ethical part to this, but there's also a practical part to the reason why we want to disrupt bias of that sort.
So would you call that person an upstander? Somebody who's like, he's observing that there is clearly bias going on here, and I need to, step up for whatever reasons, right? As some of the reasons that you just explained, but really who kind of like takes a stand against it and changes it.
Yeah, and I think it's important, upstander, he wasn't standing up for Aileen. I mean, Aileen is certainly capable of standing up for herself, but he was standing up to the situation. He was intervening in some way. And I think, again, if we go back to the different roles, when you observe this stuff, it's your job to intervene in some way, because nobody, I don't think, wants to be the silent bystander. Sure. So you want to make sure that you're intervening in some way.
And upstanders, you write, there are some strengths that they have, right? I mean, they have strength in numbers. They're they're sort of a neutral third party, right? They can take a stand and identify when bias is taking place with some good results, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, from a purely utilitarian point of view, it was much easier for him to point this out than it would have been for Aileen. Because if Aileen had pointed it out, then don't make a big, we go back to those rational, don't make a big deal of it. Oh, you're being abrasive, more bias. Very often when the person who's the target of the bias points the bias out, more bias gets heaped on them. And so, and also I think the guys on the other side of the table were going to more likely feel defensive if Aileen had said something than if he did.
Using that scenario though, so you've got the upstander, right? So that's the person who does, who stands up against, the bias. That's the observer as it is. You then talk about, the people that are causing harm, and I'm assuming you mean in that example, like the other parties that came into that meeting, that sat across from the men, that were, Aileen's, colleagues, they were the ones that were causing the harm. So, what exactly do you mean by a bias buster when it pertains to people that are causing harm?
So one of the things that I did as I was writing this book, Just Work, because this is, the last thing I wanted to do in this book was to play the role of the person causing harm.
Right.
And given that I'm talking about workplace injustice, and I mean, I started writing this book a long time ago, but as I was finishing it, after the murder of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, like I did not want to be the white woman who was causing harm by writing this book, and I was very conscious of the fact that was a real.
But I do want to say, like, in your defense, I'm also getting from you, because you said at the beginning that you've been dealing with this for a while. I think you actually started writing this book like 20 years ago.
Yeah,
maybe longer. It's just
Yeah, actually more than that. Probably I started on the tennis court when I was 7 years old, I guess. Yeah, that's probably.
So it's been in there all this time.
It's been spinning around. Absolutely. So anyway, Bias busters. I wanted to make sure that I was aware. I didn't want to put the burden on other people to tell me. So I hired someone to read the book. I hired Breeze Harper to read the book and to point out to me, she has a firm called Critical Diversity Solutions, and to point out to me when I was using language that was problematic.
Okay.
And so she pointed out to me probably 8 words that I tend to use, and one of them was see. I tend to use the sloppy site metaphors. I tend to use the word see when what I really mean is understand or notice.
Okay.
And so a couple of things that were sort of amusing about this. The first was when I got this list of 8 words, my initial instinct was defensive. There's no word that's safe in the English language, and there's 200,000 words or something, and I was misusing 8 of them. So there were, a lot of words that were still safe.
Right.
But unfortunately, I think people often do have that response when we talk about this stuff. So, and I did too, as the person causing harm. But then I sort of took a deep breath and realized, okay, this is why I'm writing this book. So I really understood. She explained to me what the problem was with sloppy site metaphors. And I understood this anyway, because another one of the people who is helping me with the book is Zach Shore, who's one of the clearest, most insightful editors I've ever worked with. Mm-hmm. And he's also blind. Mm-hmm. And so the last thing I wanted to do, not only was this an abstract, I didn't want to be ableist in the abstract, I specifically didn't want to use language that was gonna be harmful to Zach.
Okay.
So I got it. I got it, right? And then right before I sent the book to my editor for the final time, I decided I better do a search and make sure that I haven't, a few C's haven't slipped in when I meant notice. Guess how many times I had misused the word C after I was aware?
I have no idea. Go ahead.
99 times in a 350-page book.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah, it is. Right. Yeah, you got to work on these things. It takes some persistence.
So, okay. So there you give yourself as a perfect example of the person who causes harm, right? I mean, that is what's going on. So, you mentioned one of the ways that you got rid of sort of your prejudices. I mean, you went to an outsider who pointed this stuff out to you, but what do you do? I mean, give some advice.
I want to interrupt you there. It was a bias, not a prejudice, because I don't really consciously think that blind people don't understand things.
I'm glad you said that. You said that. It's important to point that out. So how do you realize when you're doing stuff like that? And, and if you have prejudices, and you recognize them, I mean, how do you, well, first of all, how do you get rid of them? How is it possible to let them go? You talk about that in the book. I'm kind of curious if you want to share with me just some of your thoughts now.
Yeah. So let's move on. Well, let's stick with bias for a minute, and then we'll move on to prejudice. I think that for one of the things you can do, especially if you're a leader, is you can create these bias interrupters or bias disruptors.
Okay.
This is one of the things that Trier and I work with teams to do all the time. So 3 parts to a bias disruptor. The first part is you want to come up with a shared vocabulary. So when I say something biased, Trier will say purple flag. And if we're on video, she'll wave a purple flag. And that makes it easier. Like now we both know what's going on. It's like a shortcut, shared vocabulary. And then the next thing that we have worked, by the way, you don't have to use purple flag. Like one team, if you don't like purple flag, one team we work with uses yo. Another team has kind of a cat theme and they meow at each other, whatever works for you and your team culture.
Okay.
Okay. So that's one. The second part is you want to, were you going to say something?
Yeah. I was just to make sure that I get my arm around this. So you have a team of people and those people themselves have some type of a code word, an indication, a flag, whatever it is, when they see somebody else demonstrating some type of bias. Is that okay?
So you're in a meeting,
basically calling that person out in front of the team.
We say you're calling them in.
You're calling them in
because you don't want to. You're not shaming them, but you're helping them learn something that they want to learn.
Okay,
right?
That's
and
great.
So, like one team holds up a peace sign, says peace, and whenever this, and that is a way of calling people in.
Okay.
And another team says, I don't think you meant that the way it sounded. There's a bunch of different, whatever phrase. Some teams like to use Daniel Kahneman's language from Thinking Fast and Slow.
Okay.
That's a little wonky for other teams. Whatever will work for your team. So you got your shared vocabulary. The next thing you want to do is you want to help people move through their shame when they're the one who has said the biased thing, when they're the one who's caused harm. And it's not complicated. You want to teach people to say in those moments, thanks for pointing it out. And either I get it, I will try not to do it again, but please tell me if I do. Or thanks for pointing it out. I don't get it. I don't know what I did wrong. And this is really hard because sometimes someone will point out something that you've said and you don't know what's wrong with it. And so now you're doubly ashamed. You're ashamed because you've harmed someone, but you don't even know what you did wrong. So you're ignorant. And helping people learn how to realize that these are things we all do to one another and we're learning together is really important. And then the third part of did you want to say something?
Nope, go ahead, keep going.
The third part of the bias disruptors is sort of a shared commitment. So if you and I get to the end of this podcast and we haven't disrupted any bias, then we should think about what did we miss? Because if you're not looking for it, then the pattern continues.
Got it. So we're talking bias now, though, which is fine. Prejudice is more serious, right? So so do you take the same approach when it comes to identifying prejudice? Because that seems to me something that would be a little bit more confrontational or particularly if you're in a group. So tell me what happens, like how can you identify that and get that communicated that there is prejudice going on? And second part of that question is, okay, say if you're like, hey, Gene, your behavior or what you were saying here, it's not just bias, you are behaving with prejudice here. How should I respond? Okay, I want to make good on this. What do I do?
Yeah. So first, let's talk about how to point it out, and then let's talk about how to respond when your prejudices have been pointed out. So one of the things that I think is useful in the face of prejudice is to remember that people can believe whatever they want. You can't control that, but they cannot say or do whatever they want. They can't impose their beliefs on another person. Okay. And where that line is a little different at a lot of different places. So it's helpful if you're the leader of a company to have a code of conduct so people know where that line is. But anyway, in general, I think it's useful to use an it statement to point it out. So for example, Trier, who co-founded Just Work With Me, tells a story about being in a hiring meeting. And the hiring committee had interviewed 10 different candidates. And everyone agreed by far the most qualified candidate was a Black woman who had worn her hair out naturally in the interviews. And the hiring manager said, well, we can't put an offer. We can't give her an offer. And Trier said, why not? And she said, well, we can't put that hair in front of the business. And, everyone in the meeting was gobsmacked because nowhere in the job description did it say anything about hair. And so an it statement can appeal to one of three things. It can appeal to the law, it can appeal to an HR policy, or it can appeal to common sense. So it is illegal, which it was in that state, not to hire someone because of their hair. It is an HR violation, which it was at that company, not to hire someone because of their hair. Or it is ridiculous not to hire the most qualified candidate because of their hair. So that is an it statement. It kind of points out where that line is. Because if you use an I statement, like with bias and I don't think you meant that the way it sounded. An I statement invites someone in to understand things from your perspective. But if an I statement kind of like holds up a mirror. But if it's prejudice that you're confronting, you're going to hold up the mirror and the person's going to smile and like what they see. You know, they actually believe the thing.
So my takeaway from what you're saying is that, again, if it's bias, you can get away with using I statements as it is, right? Because it is that much more personal. But if we're moving into the area of where something is prejudice or prejudicial, using it statements makes it more of a factual thing, makes it less personal. And that you're saying that is has more success in getting through to a person who is demonstrating that prejudice. Is that
yes? Because an it statement sort of says you can believe that, but you cannot do that.
Makes sense.
And that is, and there are going to be times where you want to get into a conversation with a person about their beliefs, but usually at work or in life, we don't actually like to do. We want to avoid those conversations.
Okay,
we just want them to knock it off.
Let's pivot because we have so much more that I want to cover. So we've talked about bias, we've talked about prejudice, we've talked about upstanders, we've talked about people that are you're sort of committing the bias and or prejudice. Let's now move to management. Let's move to leadership, and you have a whole section in your book that talks about leadership and dealing with certain discrimination and harassment, which is obviously a huge issue for a lot of businesses. So let's first of all get some definitions down. You do make a definition of discrimination. How do you define discrimination?
Yeah, discrimination is sort of what happens when power gets laid on top of bias or prejudice. So I don't hire this person because, for unconscious reasons, I chose this person instead of that person, rather than really looking at their skills. Or as in the case with the woman who wore her hair out, that was actually, it was prejudice. And then that hiring manager had the power to put the prejudice into practice and not hire her. So that's what causes discrimination, really, is power plus bias or prejudice.
I love the way that you've constructed this, by the way, because you not only start out with the people, but, you go into bias, which then could lead to prejudice, which then ultimately leads to discrimination and harassment. I didn't take in my notes here, but did you have a separate definition for harassment as well?
Yeah.
I didn't take the time to write about. Tell me about that.
Yeah. So harassment for me is more bullying plus power. It's one thing if a peer tells you, let's say, an off-color joke. But if your boss tells you an off-color joke, it crosses the line over into harassment, verbal harassment. And in the book, I distinguish between verbal harassment and physical violations. Those sort of, if you think about bullying and power, that's what happens. Is harassment, and physical violations is sort of physical touch plus power.
Got it.
And very often people who have power are more likely to approach those who don't and to touch them in ways they don't want to be touched. And so I think it's really important to be aware of that, especially if you have power and you don't want to make people uncomfortable in the way you come up to them and grab them.
It's funny, I just personally, Kim, I've experienced that myself as well. Like I run a 10-person company, I have 10 employees, and I recently was searching, for somebody to help me out with some research and marketing. And there were a few young women that, applied for the job. And I thought to myself, there is such a power dynamic going on here. You realize how vulnerable younger women are, particularly if they're dealing with men of my age. I'm in my 50s, that, it's, I'm the business owner, I'm the boss, I'm making the decisions. And, I'm just a little small business, but you imagine, the situation that women are put in particular, when they're going after, jobs, it's their career, it's their,
Yeah.
it's such a serious issue that just, only recently has gotten, I think, the kind of attention it deserves. But I just didn't understand it as a guy until I grew into this age and this responsibility. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, no, it's remarkable the things that will happen. I mean, I remember one time, I think I tell the story in the book. I was giving a talk to a team about leadership,
Mm-hmm.
and the vice president who managed the team, it's like room full of 500 people, stood up on stage and he shook my colleague's hand, who was a man. He shook the next guy's hand, and then I stuck my hand out for him to shake it. And instead of shaking my hand, he grabbed it and he kissed it, and he kind of like licked it. It was disgusting. It was like all I could do not to wipe I don't know why. I should have wiped my hand on my pants.
Yeah.
But anyway, and that was bad. Like, that was a physical violation. Not the worst thing that ever happened to anybody, for sure, but it was gross. But what was almost even worse about that moment was that nobody came up to me afterwards and said, "Ooh, that was gross. Are you okay?" There was no upstander. And so then I was like, is it just me? Or, and that when no upstander comes up, and that's one of the ways you can be an upstander, by the way. You don't have to go and punch that guy in the face. You can just come to me and say, "Are you okay? That was gross." That is a great way to be an upstander.
Yeah. And it's funny, I bet you if anybody did take any notice of it, they probably said, like, "Oh, he's a good guy. He didn't mean much."
Yeah. He's just, he was French, he's just French, but like French, not all the French guys I've met have licked my hands,
You include a few real world stories in your book, particularly in the section about leadership. You talk about Krista Quarles, I think I'm pronouncing
Quarles.
Quarles.
Krista Quarles, yeah.
Quarles from Open Table, and Scott O'Neill at the 76ers. I'm from Philly. Both, had success stories about hiring more women. And I thought it would be helpful if maybe you shared one or both of those stories about how, these leaders did what they had to do to make sure they were minimizing, if not, entirely preventing discrimination in the hiring process.
Yeah, but both of these are leaders who I admire tremendously. And in fact, Scott O'Neill has a new book out, which you should check out. It's called Stand Where Your Feet Are, Be Where Your Feet Are. Anyway, it's a great book. So Scott was very committed. He was building out his organization, and there was a woman who was the top saleswoman on the team. And he was talking to her, and she said she was going to leave. And he was desperate for her to stay. And he said, "Why would you leave?" And she said, "Well, when I look at the people at the top of this organization, I feel like it's not going to be possible for me to be a mother and have this job." Right. And he realized he needed to hire, and he knew, to his credit, that he could talk till he was blue in the face about being a father, and he's a very committed father and coached his daughter's sports teams, but he knew that what is really necessary is to have examples, to have sort of people ahead of you who can demonstrate that, yes, you can do this. And he hired someone. He went out explicitly looking for a mother, and he hired someone who had taken time out to be with her son. So this was unusual. I think very often there's kind of a penalty to parents, and it's not only women who do this, men do this too, but who take a few years to be with their young children. And he said, actually, that's a feature, not a bug. I'm going to give her credit on the resume for those couple of years.
Sure.
And the person who he hired wound up being, one of the star performers on the team, and they retained the star salesperson. And Scott also did other things, like when he was interviewing people, he noticed, for example, one woman he was interviewing looked uncomfortable. Okay. And he said, is there something I'm doing that's making you uncomfortable? And she started to laugh, and the couch in his office was kind of built for basketball players who were 7 feet tall. And she couldn't, her legs were going to stick out Thumbelina style, but she couldn't sit properly. So he got some cushions for his couch. Very simple solutions. But it took him being aware enough of her discomfort and confident enough to ask her what was making her uncomfortable. Sure. And willing to take action on it. So nothing like earth-shattering. None of this takes, right. but also really important.
Right. Fair enough. All right. Listen, we're talking about the organization. I want to get some thoughts from you on some specific organizational issues that you mentioned in the book. But before you even get to that, you do talk very briefly about the CEO. I mean, the tone does come from the top.
Yeah.
And, my audience are, the people that are watching this. I mean, I write for, and I have a lot of small business owners that are, and, the average age of the U.S. small business owner, Kim was like 55 years old. It's like a different generation.
That's me.
Yeah. So me too. And so it's, it's just a different generation. So what happens when the CEO is misbehaving? How does an organization handle that? And there can be all levels of misbehavior. It might even be so-called innocent misbehavior, but misbehavior in general. What are your thoughts on that, and how does an organization deal with that?
Well, I think that one of the more painful lessons I learned in the course of my career was, I thought, I had experienced, and I described this in sort of great gory detail in Just Work, but I had experienced a fair amount of workplace problems, and everything from the physical to being underpaid. And I sort of decided at one point in my career that if I were the CEO, if I were in charge, everything would be sweetness and light. And I think I think I'm not alone in feeling that way. I think a lot of people have that feeling about the world. If only I were in charge. Ian McEwan has a great book, Atonement, where there's a phrase in there. If only I had unlimited control, then none of this would be happening.
Correct.
And I found that when I was the CEO, that I didn't always respond. I wasn't always as conscious of what was going on around me as I should have. And I didn't always respond the way I should have. And so there was a time when there was a guy who was working for me who, first of all, he kind of tried to bully me. And instead of responding like a leader ought to and saying, you cannot talk to the women, if you're talking to me this way, how are you talking to the women who work for you? And this is not acceptable. I should have nipped it in the bud, but I didn't want to make him feel uncomfortable. I thought he's a good guy, all the excuses you give yourself. And so I just sort of let it go. And the problem with letting bullying go when you're the leader is that it's going to escalate. And so, unfortunately, I had the opportunity to see how that worked. So a few weeks later, we're at all hands. We had the obligatory tech boxes of pizza. And a woman who worked for this guy came up to him. He was sitting on a table, and the garbage can was underneath him. And she said she had an empty plate with a crust of pizza on it, obviously needed to throw it away. And she walked up and she said, I need to. And then he spreads his legs and he's like, get in between my legs.
Oh my God.
And it was like one of those moments where you're like, what? But again, I responded not like a leader should have, but like the person harmed. And I kind of rolled my eyes and pulled the garbage can out for her. And tried to like make light of the situation. Whereas what I should have done was say, all right, time out. You and I need to go talk. That's not acceptable. In front of everybody. I needed to make, that's a time when you need to make a big deal and publicly about something. And, but I didn't do that. And then later she said she felt like I had created a hostile work environment for women because of my failure to act. And obviously that was not my intention, but my intentions don't matter. It's the results that matter.
Yeah.
And that was a hard moment for me as a leader, because I felt so
Did you
innocent.
recognize at the time?
I did not.
You did not.
No. I'm deeply ashamed. What I did, you want me to tell you what I did?
Please.
True confession?
Sure.
She told me this at a time when we were doing layoffs. And so she left the company and I made her sign an NDA and paid her a little bit of money. Okay. That is illegal in the state of California now. And I'm glad it is. That is a misuse of the instrument of NDA. You should never do that. But that was what my lawyer told me to do, who was also a woman. So I think it's really important to recognize that when you, and the thing that I learned from that later, after a lot of therapy and thinking about it a bunch, was that the problem in that case, in part, was that I had unilateral control. When I started that little company, it was very important for me to be in control. And so there was nowhere for her to go to complain about my behavior, my response to his inappropriate comment to her. And so checks and balances, when you're setting up an organization and you're the CEO, it's really important to put in place checks and balances so that no one at that company, even you, has unilateral decision-making authority. And this was something that Shona Brown, who was the head of business operations, the SVP of business operations at Google, she very consciously put these checks and balances in place at Google. And Google was not perfect, and it seems to be even less perfect now than it was when I was there. A lot of people have not been treated right. But Google was actually the best place I had ever worked. And there was less discrimination, harassment, physical violations at Google than the other places I had worked. And I attribute a lot of that to the checks and balances she put in place. So no manager could unilaterally hire or fire someone. There were committees for those things. No manager could unilaterally give someone a promotion or a bonus. And those checks and balances made a big difference, both in practical terms. People make better decisions as teams, if the team is well functioning, than as individuals. And it prevented these kind of abuse of power or just nowhere to escalate to.
But in your situation, though, how would a checks and balances had stepped in? I mean, the guy behaved, like in an inappropriate way during sort of a social public event. I mean, it's not like you were hiring or firing him, or there wasn't any decisions that were being made at the time. You just didn't act on it. You didn't call the guy out because you didn't realize that it was whatever. So it happened. But
I did realize. I just didn't. I wanted to make it go away fast.
Right. Okay.
Which is what happens, I think, a lot.
But when you say checks and balances, though, and I just, the reason why I ask that is because there's stuff that happens in the workplace all the time that that may or may not be subject to an internal control that could stop it from happening.
Yeah. So here's what could have happened. There could have been an HR person at that company who had a direct line to the board, the way that a CFO at a company has a direct line to the board. And not every small business has a board of directors, but we did. And so there just needed to be someone else she could go and talk to who could come and give me that feedback. Because probably I mean, probably. I like to think I would have responded well to the feedback if I had gotten it. In a different way than with some teeth. Like by the time she gave me the feedback, I was very defensive, and she really didn't have any ability to create any check and balance on my
And I
behalf.
bet you, if you got the feedback more timely, you could have responded back to that employee more timely as well.
Yeah.
Like the next day or 2 days later,
Yeah.
say,
And then it wouldn't have been a hostile work environment.
yeah, then it would have been something much different.
But
Okay.
she understandably didn't feel safe telling me that I had screwed, well, like, which is also a failure. You should make sure that people feel safe to criticize you
Absolutely.
as a leader directly to you. But the fact of the matter is people are often not going to feel safe speaking to power. And so you need to give them other mechanisms.
Which leads me into my next question. And, again, we're running out of time and I apologize for this, but, you have a whole section about creating a culture of consent. You talk about and give some of your thoughts on alcohol in the workplace and casual hookups and, the abuse of power. And I wish I had more time because I would actually love you to share some of that. But you know what, if you're watching this and enjoying this conversation, which how can you not, go and buy Kim's book because you'll
read the book.
You'll hear her thoughts on it. But you just mentioned about, having that sort of way to communicate when things do happen. And you talk about a trust reporting system. So share with us what you mean by that.
So very often people who report physical violations or even violence in the workplace say that the investigation is as traumatic or more traumatic than the actual assault itself. And that just should not be. And then there are other times when people who are accused of sexual assault feel like the reporting mechanism is not fair to them either. So I think they're on no side of this equation do people like these investigations. And yet the investigations have got to happen. So one of the mechanisms that I really admire is called Callisto, and this works primarily at universities. But there's a new company called Not Me that is creating a similar kind of reporting mechanism for the workplace, where if someone does something, you can report it anonymously. And then if the same person gets reported anonymously, the people who've been harmed by these events can talk to each other and decide what to do. Because very often you have a large number, not all of them, but a decent percentage of these kinds of really bad physical violations, sexual assault, happen from repeat offenders. And so if you can get the repeat offenders, and what CEO wants to keep the repeat offenders at their company? Hopefully none of them, except for those who are themselves the repeat offenders, which unfortunately happens sometimes, but usually not. So you want to make sure that you get those people out of your company, and having an ability for people to report anonymously, and then you see trends. Like, I'm not saying it's an automatic guilt verdict if the same person gets reported several times. There are ways to game these systems, of course, but it's rare that that's what is going on. And at the very least, it should trigger a fast and fair investigation. So I think that's what I mean, is you want to make sure, you also want to make sure that the executives at your company understand kind of what sexual assault is and don't fall prey to the myths that are very prevalent in our society, that they know that very often people who are sexually assaulted, they don't scream and yell, and they don't respond the way that the movies portray these things.
I'm a full believer that most people really know the right thing to do and know when they're doing the wrong thing. And I understand there can be a gray area, and even situations like you mentioned when you're with that employee, like sometimes you don't realize it right away that there's something. And whenever any of these incidents happen, whether it's discrimination, harassment, bias, prejudice, in the workplace. Maybe it's just the accountant in me. I feel like it all comes down to a system of reporting. I feel like it all, like, if employees know that they can have a confidential place to report something without it coming back to harm them, not only does it know if somebody's harmed, but also people that are, that are committing the harm, even the ones that are, like you said, the upstanders, that see it. It's a way to share that and also to just know that even if it's being reported, that doesn't mean that somebody's going to get fired. It doesn't mean that the place gets turned upside down, but there's going to be some process to deal with that incident so that people can work their way through it and get it resolved and move on.
Yeah.
I just feel like it's just reporting is the most important part of this entire discussion.
Yeah, I think reporting is really, really important, but there's also that investigative process, and we are not good at it.
Yeah.
Like, our court system is, in many ways an injustice system. These systems of reporting at universities are highly flawed, and it is really hard to do good investigations. I also think that there's the Center for Institutional Courage has a lot of great ideas around this. Like, you want your institution to respond to this stuff with courage, and that's what helps the institution heal and the person who was harmed heal, and helps the person who caused harm to learn a better way of being, hopefully. But I think we really don't want to. One of the early chapters is called "We Can't Fix Problems We Refuse to Notice," right. And we don't. It's hard to notice this because you don't want to know. David Leonard, the New York Times columnist, wrote a great piece about Harvey Weinstein, and someone said everybody, bleeping knew,
right.
And that was true. Everybody did know, and yet nobody took action. Right. And I think we're at this moment in our society where now we know more about racism. We should have known all along, but now it's impossible not to notice it after the murder of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter. And we also know more about what happens to women, thanks to Me Too. Right. And the question is, are we going to take action now that we know? It's like an Oedipal moment. Are we going to look and notice and do something, or are we going to gouge our eyes out? And I hope we don't gouge our eyes out as society. Although with this banning of books business, it appears that there's a trend in that direction, unfortunately.
It's all about respecting each person's individuality, Kim, so you can just collaborate and get shit done. Am I right?
Yes, that's all it's about. So
I didn't even say that.
Respect and collaborate.
That's right. That's right. The book is called Just Work, Get Shit Done, Fast and Fair. The author is Kim Scott, who I've been talking to for almost the past hour. Kim, thank you so much for joining me. The book is great. We have barely scratched the surface of some of the things that are there. And one of the things that I'll leave our viewers with is at the end of the book, you do talk about why there are some downsides to a zero tolerance policy.
Yes.
And I think if you're, if you're interested in what those downsides are, pick up the book and read it, because a lot of people just sort of, they have this knee-jerk reaction saying, we're going to have a zero tolerance policy to any type of, bias or prejudice, discrimination, harassment, and that might not be the best way to go. But don't give anything away now, Kim. Buy the book.
I'm not going to give it away. I'm going to give you some fast breaking news, though.
Go ahead.
So Just Work, I got a lot of feedback. People hate the subtitle. So now we've changed it now. So the new subtitle, I love Get Shit Done Fast and Fair.
I do too.
But a lot of people, but we're in the minority. So I listened to the feedback. The new subtitle is How to Root Out Bias, Prejudice, and Bullying to Create a Kick-Ass Culture of Inclusivity.
All right. Well, I think maybe that'll be more amenable to a corporate America HR.
Yeah, I kind of like to get shit done, but
Right. I me too. Yeah, you get to a certain point in your life where you're like, you know what? Can we just like say what we want to say?
yes,
Get shit
yeah.
done.
It's the great benefit of being in one's 50s.
It is true. It is true. Well, Kim, great talking with you. That was enjoyed the conversation very much. For all of you guys who are watching, thank you very much for joining us for this segment of BizBooks. You can catch more of our right the base. Why did I say something wrong? Did I do something?
You all, not you guys.
Oh.
I'm not a guy. See, there you go. I knew we were going to get a purple flag in there.
That is funny that you did. And it's funny when I speak to groups, I always be like you guys, and I sometimes catch myself and I'm like, I apologize in advance. I've been doing it for 50 years. I can't change it.
I know it's hard. It's hard to change it.
Right.
It's hard to change it.
So if you all are watching this and you are enjoying the conversation, buy Kim's book. For other conversations I've had with other great business books offers, please visit us at our BizBooks YouTube page, where you can see on the screen right now. My name is Gene Marks. Thank you so much for joining us. Kim, thank you for joining me. This was a lot of fun, and we will see you again in the future on another episode of BizBooks. Take care.
Thank you.